Hey guys, tonight we're slipping out across the wind-whipped grasslands of medieval Mongolia. The stars above you blink clear and sharp, stitched across a dark velvet sky that never seems to end. Below your boots, just endless steppe, sparse trees, the soft sway of wild grasses brushing your ankles as you move. No city lights, no hum of traffic, just the whisper of the wind and the low, distant snort of grazing ponies. Somewhere not far off, a yurt's canvas flutters and the faint scent of wood smoke clings to the cold air. You're here to witness the quiet rise of someone you've probably never heard of yet, whose fingerprints are on every corner of the largest contiguous empire the world has ever known. Her name is Sorghaghtani Beki, and while her story doesn't begin with thunder or bloodshed, you'd be wise not to get too comfortable, because Mongol politics, let's just say it wasn't exactly a book club. You probably won't survive this dynasty without a few arrows pointed your way. Metaphorically, of course. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's tuning in from. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin where she did, born under an open sky, likely sometime in the late 12th century. Her people, the Karaites, were no small band of wandering herders. They were a powerful steppe tribe, allied with Genghis Khan himself, and they practiced something rather unusual for the region, Nestorian Christianity. A branch of the Christian faith, long forgotten by most Western textbooks, it flourished quietly in parts of Central Asia, often blending with local customs in curious ways. It's one of many things that made Sorghaghtani unusual right from the start. Her father was Jaka Gambu, a chieftain among the Karaites, and this is where things get spicy, an uncle by marriage to Genghis Khan. So yes, Sorghaghtani was born into a tangled net of alliances, rivalries, and power plays that would shape the world stage for decades to come. From a young age, she would have known the weight of eyes watching her, measuring her, perhaps not for beauty or wit, but for her usefulness, because on the steppe, daughters were chess pieces just as much as sons. And oh, the chessboard was crowded. You've got the Tatars to the east, the Jin dynasty looming like a crumbling but still dangerous wall in the south, and dozens of nomadic clans vying for space water and revenge. It's the kind of environment where you learn quickly, like toddler-level quickly, that silence is safer than opinion, that power rides on horseback, and that names matter. By the time Sorghaghtani was a teenager, the great Genghis Khan had risen to unify most of the Mongol tribes. His empire was expanding like spilled ink across parchment. As part of solidifying alliances, he married his sons into powerful families like the Karaites, and that's how Sorghaghtani's path was drawn. She was married to Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest and reportedly most volatile son. Think of Tolui as the axe to his older brother's sword and spear, blunt, brutal, and devastating. His job: breaking resistance. He didn't govern. He raised. His campaigns against the Jin and Khwarezmian empires left entire cities in ash, and yet Sorghaghtani, not just a bride, but now a Beki, a noble consort, was expected to stand beside him, quietly absorbing the carnage and translating it into structure. Historians still argue whether Sorghaghtani had any choice in her marriage to Tolui, but even if she didn't, she played the hand she was dealt with a kind of unnerving grace. As Tolui slaughtered his way through Central Asia, Sorghaghtani was building the tent of stability behind him, raising their sons, organizing their lands, whispering words that would one day shape kings. Here's a lesser-known tidbit: Sorghaghtani didn't ride into battle. She didn't brandish a sword or command troops, but she did manage immense tracts of land, trade routes, and people. In Mongol law, women could own property, manage estates, and oversee livestock herds. So, while Tolui was out, shall we say, reorganizing cities with fire and arrows, Sorghaghtani kept the home empire running like an oiled bowstring. Her yurt wasn't just a place for spinning yarns and warming mare's milk. It became a mobile command center, a place where letters were read, edicts drafted, and futures shaped. It said she surrounded herself with scholars, advisors, and merchants. And while the steppe didn't exactly offer a Harvard MBA, Sorghaghtani had something better: first-hand knowledge of power, sharpened by watching the great Khan himself play politics on a planetary scale. There's an eerie sort of irony to how little we know of her early personal thoughts. No diary entries, no teary letters, just actions calculated, steady, and often ahead of their time. It makes you wonder how many great figures in history worked not with words or swords, but with silence and precision. And yet, she was not merely passive. Her Nestorian faith wasn't just private piety. It opened doors. Nestorian priests often doubled as diplomats, translators, and spies. Through them, Sorghaghtani accessed information networks stretching from Baghdad to Beijing. She built a web, one invisible to most generals, but potent enough to change the trajectory of empires. So, as you lie back, listening to the hush of wind across that great grassland, imagine the teenage Sorghaghtani, calm eyes, patient hands, quietly watching Mongol armies thunder past, knowing she's not the rider, she's the reins. By now, you've settled into the rhythm of steppe life. The clip-clop of hooves in the distance, the low lull of wind brushing against felt walls, the occasional laughter of children outside the yurt. But within Sorghaghtani's world, the stillness masks a storm of calculation, because marriage in her case is not a soft union of hearts. It's a battlefield of politics, and the stakes are dynastic. Sorghaghtani is married to Tolui, and with that, she becomes part of the house of Genghis Khan, which sounds glamorous until you realize Genghis doesn't run a family so much as a war machine. The Khan's 4 sons, Jochi, Chagatai, Ogadei, and Tolui, aren't siblings in the way modern sitcoms would like you to imagine. They're 4 centers of gravity, each pulling for power, wealth, and the title of Supreme Khan. And poor Sorghaghtani, she's now tethered to the youngest and most unpredictable of the bunch. Tolui is fire. Not metaphorical fire, actual fire. He's known for burning cities to the ground, drinking deeply, and perhaps surprisingly displaying loyalty to his father above all else. He's less interested in court politics than he is in battlefield glory. Historians still argue whether he had any real ambition beyond killing things efficiently. And yet, Sorghaghtani sees beyond that. She doesn't try to temper him because that never works with men like Tolui. She lets him burn. And while he does, she begins the long, careful work of building a dynasty. 4 sons come from their union, Monka Kublai Hulagu and Arik Boka. If those names sound familiar, it's because together they'll one day rule from Baghdad to Beijing, from the Himalayas to Hungary. And how does Sorghaghtani raise them? Not like typical Mongol warlords in training. Sure, they learn to ride shoot and drink fermented mare's milk without flinching. But she also ensures they learn languages, Chinese, Persian, Turkic dialects. She brings scholars into camp, priests, merchants, even mathematicians. Her boys don't just learn how to conquer, they learn how to rule. This is where the real genius comes in. In a world obsessed with short-term gain, plunder, the city take the loot move on Sorghaghtani thinks long. She plans across generations. She understands that empires built by swords fall fast unless someone can translate victory into governance. There's one especially quirky story. When her sons were young, she reportedly ensured they watched how officials in conquered regions managed grain storage, tax collection, and irrigation. Imagine little Kublai Khan perched on a crate watching a civil servant tally rice receipts in northern China. It's almost funny, until you remember that this same Kublai would go on to found the Yuan dynasty and become Emperor of China. Coincidence? Historians still debate it. But the marriage itself, was it happy? That's where things get murky. Mongol sources are curiously silent on emotional detail. No poetry, no romantic laments. We don't know if Tolui was kind or cruel to her. What we do know is this Sorghaghtani endured. She kept her sons close. She secured their positions. She managed lands and logistics. That's not just survival. That's dominance in the quietest possible way. And let's talk about her influence over Tolui, not in the public sense, not as an empress issuing proclamations, but in the 1,000 tiny decisions that shape a legacy. She likely advised him on his appointments, gently steered him away from destructive impulses, and softened the edges of his vengeance. She was no stranger to Mongol law either. Women in her position could issue orders, arbitrate disputes, and hold lands in their own right. One Persian historian later called her more intelligent than any man. He meant it as a compliment, though probably with some surprise. Even as Tolui drank heavily, a habit that would prove fatal, Sorghaghtani kept the family's reputation spotless. She refused to entangle herself in the bloodier parts of succession squabbles that had already begun to simmer between her in-laws. She knew the value of staying in the second row, visible, respected, but never threatening. At least, not yet. And then there's her household. You might imagine a yurt full of leather-wrapped warriors and snarling dogs, but Sorghaghtani's camp was something different. She made room for scholars, Christian clerics, and visiting dignitaries. One Chinese monk, who visited years later, described her retinue as cultured, clean, and unnervingly organized. For a Mongol court, that was almost suspicious. In a society where military merit ruled, Sorghaghtani crafted a model of governance in miniature. Her tent became a school. Her sons, the pupils, she offered them not just weapons, but ideas, not just discipline, but vision. And in this we see the first whispers of her long game. She doesn't crave personal power, not in the throne-warming sense. She wants influence, legacy, sons who will not just ride to war, but who will sit at the center of civilizations and shape the future. It's tempting to paint her as a proto-feminist heroine, the lone woman shaping an empire. But that would flatten her. She wasn't fighting against her world. She was working within it perfectly, patiently, like a hand stitching a tapestry in the dark, knowing the pattern won't be visible until the light hits. And yet, even now, her name remains on the fringe. Not forgotten, but not celebrated either. Overshadowed by her son's glories, by Genghis Khan's legacy, by the brutal shine of Mongol conquest. But behind each victory, each reformation, each ruler, there's Sorghaghtani, stitching, shaping, waiting. So, as the fires flicker low outside your tent and the horses begin to settle, think of her, this woman, wrapped in felt robes, voice soft but firm eyes, ever fixed on a future no one else could see. She's not just part of the Mongol story. She is the story, hidden in plain sight. You wake before dawn, no roosters here, just the scrape of hooves against frosted grass and the sharp, smoky scent of dried dung being burned for warmth. A chill presses against your cheeks. Outside, the world is steel gray, and the steppe stretches endlessly in every direction. But in Sorghaghtani's camp, the silence is pregnant with purpose. Because now, she's not just a wife or daughter-in-law. She's a mother, 4 times over, and each son is a different storm brewing on the horizon. Monka is the firstborn, reserved, observant, built for endurance rather than spectacle. Then comes Kublai, curious, charming, dangerously imaginative. Next is Hulagu, who seems born to ride through fire, ferocious, bold, and oddly tender with animals. And last, little Arik Boke, youngest, but somehow always in the middle of things, forever testing boundaries. You imagine Sorghaghtani, watching them play with carved bone figurines, lining them up like armies already calculating. Raising children in a Mongol camp is no cozy domestic affair. It's rough, it's loud, and it smells overwhelmingly like horse. But Sorghaghtani isn't content with just keeping them alive. She has a vision. These boys won't just be horse lords, they'll be empire architects. Each day she sets rhythms into their lives that echo like drum beats. Study, observe, ride, reflect. She assigns them tutors, some Muslim, some Chinese, some Christian. She encourages philosophical debates, perhaps over goat stew and boiled millet. Languages flow through their yurt like wind. Persian Uyghur script, Chinese classical poetry. It's said that even the youngest could understand complex court protocols before puberty. Whether that's legend or truth, historians still argue. Now here's the quirky part. Sorghaghtani also made sure her boys knew the value of merchants. In Mongol culture, traders weren't always seen as glamorous. Warriors earned glory, not bean counters. But Sorghaghtani knew better. She invited traders into her tent, listened to tales from Samarkand and Aleppo, and let her sons ask questions about tariffs and supply routes. Honestly, she may have invented the first Mongol MBA without realizing it. And she was strict, but not unkind. One Persian chronicler years later described her discipline as quiet as snow, firm as stone. You picture her never shouting, never striking, just expecting excellence with a stare that could chill milk. At the same time, she weaves morality into their upbringing, not just loyalty to their own, but tolerance for others. You'd see her telling young Kublai that a wise ruler listens to the conquered before commanding them, that a city isn't defeated until you understand why it stood, which, let's be honest, was a bizarre thing to say in a culture built on burning cities to the ground. But that's what makes her legacy so strange, so slippery. She's reshaping the next generation of Khans, not with swords, but with stories, questions, and structure. She's mothering kings, but not just any kings, Mongol kings. And those don't come with a handbook. One scene sticks out. A rare, vivid account suggests that when Tolui returned from campaign, bloodied and drunk, Sorghaghtani would usher the boys to sit with him, not to praise or fear him, but to listen, to understand what war cost, to read not just the victories in their father's words, but the toll carved into his shoulders. That kind of education, you can't buy it. And speaking of Tolui, his absence is frequent. The man loved war more than hearth, but that suited Sorghaghtani fine. It gave her freedom, authority, the chance to mold her sons without interference. In a society where male heirs usually learned from their fathers, hers were learning from their mother, and no one seemed to notice until it was too late. Here's the uncomfortable truth. If you were a Mongol noble in this period and not grooming your sons for power, someone else would. Power had a scent on the steppe. If your lineage couldn't wield it, others would devour it. So Sorghaghtani didn't just teach her sons survival, she taught them supremacy. And there's a deeper layer still. Nestorian Christianity. Her faith wasn't missionary in the Western sense, but it taught values like humility, mercy, and education. She passed these down subtly often through bedtime stories or council sessions. Her children might not have been baptized, but they grew up under a moral canopy most Mongols didn't have. When Kublai later banned the unnecessary slaughter of animals during certain seasons in China, many credit that sensibility to his mother's early guidance. And yet, she's walking a tightrope. One wrong lesson, one spoiled child, and the other branches of the royal family will pounce. Mongol politics was like a game of knife juggling on horseback. Drop one blade, and everyone bleeds. But Sorghaghtani doesn't falter. Her boys grow tall, sharp-minded, and poised. And word begins to spread among caravans, among scribes, among minor officials, that Tolui's widow is raising something different, something dangerous, something that might change everything. Meanwhile, she remains in the background, always the widow of Tolui, always respectful, always quiet. But every caravan that passes, every scholar who visits, every soldier who serves, her sons, they remember her, not as a figure of fear, but of strange, magnetic respect. So, as the sun rises again over the steppe, and the boys prepare to ride, you watch Sorghaghtani brush the dust from their shoulders, kiss their foreheads, and send them out, not just to learn the world, but to shape it. You hear her whisper as she turns back to her ledger, her maps, her messages. Not yet, my sons, but soon. The wind bites a little harder now, and the boys are no longer just children chasing goats with bows and wooden swords. They're growing into men with shoulders broader, questions sharper, and tempers to match. Sorghaghtani knows the clock is ticking. Childhood has slipped away like a caravan over the horizon, and now comes the most delicate chapter of all education, fit for future emperors. And no, that doesn't mean just more horseback drills or archery contests. Mongol boys learned that before they could even tie a knot. Sorghaghtani wants more. She's crafting a new type of leader, one who can both conquer and administer. That's no small thing in a world where most Khans think a battle won is a job finished. So, she builds a curriculum that would make even modern homeschoolers raise an eyebrow. Her sons study philosophy, Chinese Confucianism, Buddhist sutras, Islamic jurisprudence. They dissect strategy with advisors from Persia, question the stars with Nestorian monks, and recite verses from multiple languages. Kublai especially takes to Chinese classics, quoting them later in life with a smugness that would make your old college roommate proud. Historians still debate whether his early exposure to Chinese literature directly shaped his more syncretic rule in later decades. Either way, credit points straight back to Mom. But there's more than just books and scrolls. Sorghaghtani teaches through ritual and observation. She brings her sons to council meetings not as passive onlookers, but as silent participants. She wants them to learn how power breathes, who bows to whom, when silence carries more weight than shouting, how debts are built and favors traded without a single coin changing hands. One particularly odd little story survives from a Persian chronicler, Sorghaghtani, once made Kublai sit through a 3-day arbitration of a tax dispute between two merchants from Samarkand. 3 days of silver counting, land measuring, and legal quibbling. The poor kid was barely 12. But when the dispute was settled, she asked him, now, who truly won? Not in silver, she meant, but in respect, alliance's precedent. Kublai never forgot the question, and it shows later in how he ruled. Meanwhile, Mongke, her firstborn, shows a steadier, quieter nature. He's not flashy like Kublai or fiery like Hulagu. He's measured, focused. Sorghaghtani likely sees him as the future stabilizer, the bridge between conquest and reform. He's the one you trust with the imperial ledger, the census, the grain storehouses. Not exciting, perhaps, but essential if you don't want your empire to starve itself mid-victory. And Arik Boka, he's still a bit wild, charming, physical, instinctive. She knows he'll be useful later, but not just yet. His path needs watching. She brings in scholars from across the Silk Road, Persian administrators who can explain tax theory, Chinese engineers who sketch bridges and aqueducts, Buddhist monks who preach compassion and meditation, Muslim clerics who demonstrate how law can be scripture. Her sons grow up at the intersection of worlds, something no other Mongol prince before them had tasted. They don't just see the globe as something to conquer, they see it as something to manage, which honestly makes them freakishly modern for the 13th century. And that's not a coincidence. Sorghaghtani doesn't want them to just inherit Genghis Khan's might. She wants them to surpass it. And she knows brute force alone won't do it. The old ways ride, conquer, plunder are already creaking. The empire is growing too large. To hold it together, you need minds sharper than swords. And here comes one of the strangest contradictions of Mongol rule for a society that idolized destruction. The empire's most successful rulers were often the most tolerant. Sorghaghtani drills that in. Respect local customs. Appoint local officials. Tax fairly, or at least predictably. Build things, don't just break them. She teaches her sons to ask, what do these people need to follow us willingly? A question most conquerors never consider. And while Genghis did practice a kind of practical tolerance, especially when it came to religions, Sorghaghtani elevates it into a guiding principle. Historians still argue over whether she had an official court school or simply curated education through proximity and relationships. But the result is the same. Her sons emerge not just as heirs, but as leaders, with worldviews broader than any steppe warrior before them. And then, of course, there's the chessboard. Because while her sons are learning ethics, geometry, and the finer points of horse breeding, the rest of the empire is a pressure cooker. Genghis Khan is long dead. His chosen heir, Sorghaghtani, now rules as Great Khan. He's competent, maybe even effective, but not eternal. And everyone knows it. Behind closed doors, the knives are sharpening. Succession questions brew like storm clouds. The branches of Genghis's family eye each other warily. Will it be a peaceful handoff? Or will the next Khan rise over the bodies of his cousins? Sorghaghtani sees it coming before most. She positions her sons carefully. Monka remains close to Sorghaghtani's court, a quiet observer. Kublai begins to correspond with Chinese administrators. Hulagu cultivates military networks out west. Arik Buke, well, he keeps riding fast and hitting hard. And Sorghaghtani keeps orchestrating, ever careful, never direct. She avoids overt displays of ambition. She praises Sorghaghtani publicly, sends gifts, expresses loyalty, but behind the scenes, she's stockpiling favors, allies, leverage. That's the thing about empires. They don't rise with battle cries. They rise with marriages, debts, soft-spoken promises, in candlelit tents, and Sorghaghtani is fluent in all three. So, as the boys kneel before their scrolls, their eyes flicking over legal codes and tax laws, remember, they're not just learning how to rule. They're learning why. Because their mother has taught them that a great empire isn't built with conquests. It's built with comprehension. You feel the yurt settle as night falls. Outside the fire crackles low. Inside Monka murmurs a line of Chinese verse. Kublai's brush scratches across parchment. Sorghaghtani watches silent nodding, knowing these are not just sons. They are keystones. It's morning again on the steppe. But this time the winds carry something unfamiliar. Whispers of cities, temples, bishops, and diplomats. Sorghaghtani stands at the threshold of a new chapter diplomacy. Not the shout and slaughter kind, but the quieter, slipperier art of negotiation. And in that world, her secret weapon isn't a sword or a title. It's her faith. Nestorian Christianity, her chosen path, is one of those odd corners of history that feels like a footnote until you realize it was actually a back door into half the known world. Nestorians had been spreading eastward since the 5th century, hitching rides along trade routes, nesting in caravan cities, and embedding themselves in empires. They weren't popes or crusaders. They were merchants, healers, scribes, and they were everywhere. China, Persia, Samarkand, even wayward corners of India. And while Sorghaghtani never makes her religion her brand, she wears it like a key, unlocking networks no Mongol general could breach by force. When a Nestorian priest arrives from Baghdad, it isn't just to deliver prayers. He's likely a courier of regional news, a carrier of maps, a broker of soft influence. And Sorghaghtani, she listens carefully. Now imagine her tent incense curling in a quiet corner, scrolls laid out on a carpet from Bukhara, a translator murmuring Greek into Mongolian Sorghaghtani, cross-referencing dates and dynasties like a diplomat at a chessboard. She might be discussing silk tariffs in Chang'an one moment and peace terms in Aleppo the next. Historians still argue how much her Christianity directly influenced foreign policy. But what's clear is that she leveraged it brilliantly. She didn't force conversions. Instead, she used her faith to position herself as trustworthy to outsiders, especially when the Mongols were seen quite rightly as apocalypse on horseback. Here's a delicious fringe fact. Some European envoys, upon hearing that one of the most powerful women in the Mongol Empire was a Christian, believed she might secretly be the mythical Prester John, a fabled Eastern king expected to rescue Christendom. Sorghaghtani, meanwhile, just smiled politely and kept collecting intel. And, speaking of intel, her household staff was likely multilingual and strategically appointed. Nestorian scribes could read and write in Syriac Persian and Chinese. They carried more than messages, they carried cultural codes, rumors, and patterns. With them, Sorghaghtani built a web of soft surveillance that any modern state would envy. But diplomacy for her isn't just about letters and alliances. It's about shaping the Mongol image. Her husband's generation had been glorious, but brutal. Entire cities were wiped clean of life. Trade had flourished, yes, but under the watchful eye of cavalry. Sorghaghtani envisions something more durable. She encourages merchant protections, urges tolerance of religious minorities, advises her sons that a taxed city is more useful than a burned one. Her favorite saying, allegedly, a city that kneels feeds 10,000 soldiers. Not exactly embroidered on cushions, but you get the idea. And that tolerance isn't just theoretical. She supports Muslim officials, corresponds with Buddhist monks, hosts Confucian scholars. You get the impression her tent could double as a United Nations field office, only with more fermented milk and better horsemanship. Kublai, especially, seems to absorb this lesson. Years later, when he governs China, he draws on the multicultural blueprint his mother modeled. Instead of replacing Chinese administrators, he employs them. Instead of mocking Confucian rituals, he adopts them. Is he doing it out of genuine respect or strategic brilliance? Historians still debate it, but they agree on one thing. He learned the posture from Sorghaghtani. Even Monka, the most stoic of her sons, adopts many of her diplomatic values. When he ascends to the position of Great Khan, he invites Muslim scientists to court funds Buddhist construction and implements legal reforms that reflect his mother's sense of balance. But diplomacy wasn't without risk. In stepping into the spiritual and political space of so many peoples, Sorghaghtani risked accusations of disloyalty. A woman with foreign ties, especially Christian ties, could easily be painted as suspect. And yet, no record survives of her being publicly challenged. Why? Because she never overreaches. She never leads a faction. She never names herself a regent or issues decrees under her own name. She advises, she educates, she positions, but always through others. And that's her genius. Let's pause on a quirky anecdote. A Nestorian bishop once gifted her a rare manuscript, a blend of medical lore, spiritual guidance, and astronomy. Rather than keeping it hidden as a treasure, she reportedly made copies for her advisors and asked them to annotate it. A small act, but it shows how she saw knowledge not as prestige, but as power, best shared. So, what does all this soft power yield? Access. When Kublai Khan Ugedei's son sends envoys to Europe demanding submission, Sorghaghtani's network is already 2 steps ahead. She knows how European courts might react. She's seen their responses to Nestorian appeals. She likely knows which cities are bristling and which ones are quietly intrigued by Mongol trade offers. She doesn't write the letters. She doesn't stamp the seals. But make no mistake, she is the wind at their backs. And it's not just about the world beyond the steppe. Within the Mongol Empire, faith becomes a chess piece. Buddhists curry favor in China. Muslims dominate trade across Central Asia. Christians serve in the far west. Sorghaghtani navigates these waters like a seasoned sailor, making sure her sons know every current. And so, by the time her children reach their 20s, they're not just warriors. They're multilingual, religiously savvy, economically literate young men who understand the nuances of diplomacy better than most kings, twice their age. You sit now at the edge of her tent, watching her write by lamplight. There's no crown, no scepter, just ink-stained fingers and eyes that miss nothing. You realize that what she's building isn't just an empire of land. It's an empire of trust. The fire inside the yurt crackles, but its warmth doesn't reach the silence between Sorghaghtani's ribs. Tolui is dead. No one says it aloud at first, not in those words. They whisper instead that he fell ill, that he drank too deeply of the ritual wine during the Buddhist ceremony in memory of his father, Genghis Khan, that perhaps it was poison, that perhaps it was guilt. Historians still argue over what killed him. Official accounts say alcohol poisoning. Some conspiracies mutter about court rivals. Others suspect a karmic unraveling. Sorghaghtani doesn't speculate, not publicly. But you can imagine her reaction, a deep, slow inhale followed by a decisive nod. Because grief is a luxury she's never had time to indulge. What his death does mean, though, is a seismic shift in her position. She is now a widow, but not just any widow. She is the widow of Tolui, youngest son of Genghis, and mother of 4 legitimate grandsons of the great Khan. In Mongol politics, that's like holding a loaded quiver with no bow. You have the tools, but not yet the means. But here's the twist. Widows in Mongol culture could wield tremendous power, especially if they had sons. And Sorghaghtani, she has 4. Her rivals, of course, think she'll fade into the background now. Ogedei is still the reigning great Khan, and his faction rules from Karakoram with growing arrogance. His wife, Turagain, is ambitious and politically active in her own right, more obviously so than Sorghaghtani ever dared to be. The court is fracturing factions, sharpening their knives in the dark. And yet, Sorghaghtani doesn't seize power. She manages. She negotiates. She waits. And while she waits, she builds. She maintains full control over her late husband's appanage, that is the land, wealth, and followers assigned to Tolui's family line. She continues managing the estates, collecting taxes, overseeing livestock, and most importantly, maintaining a vast network of loyalties. She knows every steward, every merchant, every petty chieftain in her corner of the empire. And they know her. That's the advantage of ruling quietly. You're underestimated. You're seen as safe. And so, no one challenges her right to lead Tolui's domains. That would come later. For now, she has the space and the motive to move with purpose. Her sons, meanwhile, are entering manhood. Mongka, the eldest, is already proving himself in campaigns. Ogedei sends him on military expeditions to test his loyalty and perhaps, secretly, to thin the bloodline. But Mongka excels. He's measured, disciplined, and like his mother, slow to show his cards. Kublai is growing bolder, his curiosity extending toward Chinese philosophy and Han administrative models. Hulagu takes more naturally to the sword, relishing the structured chaos of battlefield command. Harik Borke remains harder to place, restless, powerful, but less diplomatic. He listens to Sorghaghtani with squinting suspicion, as if trying to decode her deeper meanings. And Sorghaghtani watches them all. She knows their strengths. She knows what each will need to survive. And she starts positioning. First, she reaches out to influential Mongol princes who feel increasingly marginalized by Ogedei's rule. Quiet words, polite gifts, alliances built on shared grievances. She doesn't rally banners or declare war. She simply makes sure that when the winds change, and they always do, her sons will have friends. Then she tightens bonds with Nestorian clerics, especially those with diplomatic ties to foreign courts. They carry messages to the Abbasid Caliphate, to European kingdoms, to minor Christian enclaves scattered across the Levant and the Caucasus. These aren't just letters of goodwill. They're threads in a global web of influence. If you're going to make emperors, you need a stage that stretches beyond the steppe. And she keeps her head down. No grand declarations, no challenges to the throne. In fact, she supports Ogedei openly sends sons to serve him, offers gifts, praises his judgment. It's all very cordial, very civil, very calculated. Here's an odd anecdote she once sent Ugadai, a rare physician trained in both Chinese and Persian medicine. A gesture of kindness, yes, but also a signal I have access to the best minds and I share them willingly. That kind of move makes rivals pause. It makes allies nod. Still, the court is volatile. Ugadai, never particularly healthy, is drinking more than ever. He begins to fumble his administration, delegating too much to cronies, ignoring the fracturing within the empire. When he dies in 1241, the Mongol world doesn't shatter, it wobbles. And in the wobble, Sorghaghtani steps forward, not with a roar, but with a whisper. She gathers support for her sons, but subtly. She builds consensus rather than cliques. She reminds distant princes that Monka is Genghis Khan's grandson through Tolui, that he's proven himself in battle, and that he carries his grandfather's discipline. She visits key allies in person, highly unusual for a noblewoman, and impresses them with her clarity, her humility, and above all, her memory. She recalls every favor owed, every alliance struck. No one leaves her presence unmoved. And here's the kicker. She does all this while maintaining her reputation as modest, devout, and apolitical. Historians still marvel at it. How did a woman so active in shaping succession avoid being labeled a threat? The answer is simple. She never appeared to want the throne for herself, just for her sons. And somehow that made it palatable, even admirable. So now as you sit in the dimming light of her yurt, the smell of warm milk and ink in the air, you realize this woman just survived the death of her husband, the dangers of imperial succession, and the chaos of a crumbling administration, all without raising her voice or losing her grip. She's not just surviving, she's positioning to win. The ground beneath the Mongol Empire is shifting, and while many race to find their footing, Sorghaghtani is already standing firm. Kublai Khan is dead, and the court enters a period of power vacuum, politely called interregnum. Though honestly, it resembles less a peaceful waiting period and more a field full of wolves sniffing one another's boundaries. Ugadai's widow, Borjigin, moves swiftly. She wants her son Guyuk to be the next great Khan, and she has no problem throwing elbows to make that happen. She stacks the regency with her allies, replaces ministers, and begins pushing opposition out of the way. On paper, it looks like a woman in power, a fellow matriarch making her move, but Sorghaghtani isn't clapping from the sidelines. She's watching, because while Borjigin reaches for the top, she forgets the foundation. She alienates nobles who feel overlooked. She favors her own branch of the family too obviously. She rushes, she overplays, and Sorghaghtani, she does the opposite. She writes letters, she visits allies, she makes tea, and all the while she continues to build the image of her sons. Not as usurpers, not as threats, but as servants, of stability. Mongke remains dutiful. Kublai immerses himself further in Chinese studies. Hulagu expands his military knowledge out west. Arik Boke sharpens his presence on the steppe, mingling with traditional Mongol elites. You get the feeling that every action, every journey, every sentence uttered in public has been vetted in Sorghaghtani's mind 5 steps ahead. Still, Guyuk does become Great Khan in 1246, and for a moment it looks like Sorghaghtani's careful work might go up in smoke. He's ambitious, proud, and less subtle than his mother. He sends letters to the Pope demanding submission. He appoints questionable men to key posts. He seems more interested in grand gestures than long-term governance. And crucially, he doesn't trust the Toluid branch that is Sorghaghtani's sons. He calls Mongke to court, possibly to test his loyalty, possibly to thin the bloodline again. Some sources even suggest Mongke may have been in danger. Sorghaghtani, unsurprisingly, doesn't protest loudly. She allows her son to go, but she ensures that his companions are loyal. She ensures he carries gifts. She ensures he keeps his head down. And Mongke, trained by the best political mind on the steppe, survives. Then, in 1248, the entire landscape changes. Guyuk suddenly dies. Historians still argue what killed him. Some say illness. Others mutter about poison or exhaustion. What's notable is that he dies en route to confront Batu, the powerful Western Khan of the Golden Horde. His death leaves a dangerous void and a chance. Batu, ever the schemer, is Genghis's grandson through Joshi, and he hates the Ogadide faction. But he doesn't want the throne. What he does want is someone else on it, someone manageable, respectful, and less likely to undermine him. And who does he trust? Sorghaghtani, the quiet widow, the woman who never once challenged Guyuk openly, the mother of 4 capable sons, the architect of a balanced empire. And so, the great political dance begins again. Sorghaghtani travels herself to visit Batu in his western territories. This is astonishing. High-ranking Mongol women often wielded power, yes, but rarely did they personally cross vast distances for diplomacy. And yet, here she is, riding over rivers, through forests, across plains, just to sit with Batu and share vision. One account describes her presence at Batu's camp as serene, full of certainty, like water that finds its way through every stone. Whether that's poetic license or not, it captures something true. She was unshakable. She speaks with Batu. She listens. She suggests. And the two form an alliance. It's agreed Mongke should be the next great Khan. But not yet. First, there must be consensus. And this is where Sorghaghtani shines. She returns home and begins building a coalition. She visits powerful Mongol princes. She rekindles old loyalties. She reminds them of their shared blood, their common interest in unity. She does not beg. She does not threaten. She simply reminds them of what's at stake, an empire too large, too fragile, too brilliant to be handed to another faction squabbling for control. And her argument is compelling. Mongke is not power-hungry. He is disciplined, tempered, a listener, a reflection of her. In 1251, the Kurultai, the Great Council, convenes, and Mongke is elected. The Toluid branch now holds the throne. And Sorghaghtani, she says nothing dramatic, no grand proclamation, no tearful speeches, just a quiet nod. And, maybe, just maybe, a private moment with her sons in the evening light, where her hand rests on Mongke's shoulder and the unspoken message passes between them. Now, build what I've prepared for you. Here's a curious fringe detail. Some sources claim she fasted during the days leading up to the Kurultai, seeking clarity and guidance. Whether that's true or not, it fits the image a woman who shaped history, not with banners or battles, but with restraint and resolve. She didn't sit on the throne. She placed someone there, and in doing so, she became more than a matriarch. She became a kingmaker. So, as the stars rise over the steppe once more, and Mongke Khan begins his reign under the echo of her legacy, you lie back and marvel. She never ruled directly. She never raised a blade. But without Sorghaghtani Beki, the Mongol Empire might have fractured, burned, or collapsed into sibling wars. Instead, it held because one woman held it together with threads of wisdom woven quietly through decades. The chill of empire always sets in after a coronation. The fireworks fade, the banners droop, and suddenly there's work to be done. Grain to measure, generals to wrangle, envoys to appease. But when Mongke Khan takes the throne in 1251, it's clear he doesn't arrive as a blank slate. He arrives with a blueprint, and that blueprint is Sorghaghtani. You can almost hear her voice in his first reforms. The steady tone, the practical priorities, taxation made uniform, corruption rooted out, campaigns planned not with arrogance, but with logistical precision. Sorghaghtani had spent decades studying how to hold power without drawing swords, and now her son begins wielding that lesson like a calligraphy brush, measured, graceful, deliberate. And how does she do it? How does she remain so quietly central even after stepping out of the limelight? Well, she never really leaves. Officially, she's just the mother of the Khan. Unofficially, she's the most trusted counselor in the empire. Mongke relies on her not just as kin, but as a strategist. He consults her before major decisions. Her correspondence continues. Visitors seek her blessing, even if Mongke has already stamped the seal. It's not unheard of in Mongol society. Women were respected property-owning and often political actors. But Sorghaghtani takes that cultural allowance and stretches it to an art form. She becomes something between oracle and architect. Now the empire is vast beyond vast. It stretches from Korea to Eastern Europe, a patchwork of conquered kingdoms, client states, and skeptical cities. And holding it all together requires more than threats. It requires understanding, a moral code, a rhythm. These are things she's spent her entire life refining. Let's pause here for a strange but delightful tidbit. Sorghaghtani is said to have personally intervened to protect certain communities: Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, when Mongol's generals leaned too hard into coercion. She reminded her son often, gently but firmly, that fear has a short shelf life. If you want loyalty, feed people, protect their temples, learn their customs. One tale, possibly apocryphal, but irresistible, claims she once chided a regional governor who had confiscated land from a Nestorian village. What grows faster, she supposedly asked, a crop watered by rain or a rebellion fed by resentment? The land was returned. Historians still argue whether these interventions were systematic policy or isolated acts. But regardless, they left an impression. Under Mongol, religious freedom becomes more than a wartime tactic. It's woven into governance. And economic reforms follow too. Sorghaghtani had long emphasized trade infrastructure, and now, with her son in charge, we see a bloom of merchant protections, way stations, and credit systems. The famed YAM, or postal relay system, expands, making communication across the empire not just possible but efficient. Her philosophy is clear. You can't run a kingdom by riding horses alone. You need scrolls. You need grain. You need numbers and roads and languages. And here comes the irony. Sorghaghtani, a woman who never stepped foot in battle, probably influenced Mongol military campaigns more than many generals did, because behind the front lines she ensured logistics worked. She ensured that local administrators cooperated, that food flowed, that soldiers' families were cared for back home. A campaign might be led by a Khan, but it marched to the quiet beat she had long been setting. And while Mongol governs her other sons, spread across the empire, Kublai, ever the intellectual, is appointed to oversee China. He brings his mother's principles with him, consults Confucian scholars, studies tax codes, invests in agricultural recovery. He will later become the first non-Han emperor of the Yuan dynasty, and many of his early policies echo his mother's lessons: rule with curiosity, not just command. Hulagu marches west, tasked with expanding Mongol authority into Persia and beyond. He builds libraries, consults astrologers, and despite his reputation for destruction, also invests in irrigation systems and patronizes science. His campaigns are brutal, yes, but his governance shows the fingerprints of a mother who taught him to value infrastructure as much as intimidation. Even Arik Boka, the least bookish of the bunch, gains influence among traditionalist Mongol factions, keeping the steppe elite aligned with the empire's evolving shape. Now, here's where things get subtle. Sorghaghtani doesn't take credit. There are no statues, no gold medallions, no declarations stamped in her name. But every corner of the empire begins to show signs of her philosophy, one that blends conquest with compassion, governance with grace. And it's not just good policy, it's good strategy. A well-fed, respected population is easier to tax. A multi-religious empire doesn't need daily purges. A literate bureaucracy catches fraud before it becomes famine. She's not building peace because she's soft. She's building peace because it lasts. Still, not all is tranquil. Mongol's rise has made enemies. The Uggadide and Chagatai lines resent the Toluid consolidation of power. Fissures deepen. Intrigue simmers beneath every imperial decree. But Sorghaghtani is ready. She's spent decades building a reserve of loyalty. She knows which generals can be trusted, which administrators need watching, which tribal leaders respond better to flattery than to threats. And she continues to advise. Even as Mongol's rule expands, even as Kublai and Hulagu become near emperors in their own right, she is the thread that connects them all. Mother, yes, but also mentor, manager, mirror. One foreign ambassador wrote somewhat breathlessly that Sorghaghtani could speak softly and make the tent tremble. Whether he meant her political weight or her ability to correct someone with a single glance is unclear. Probably both. So tonight, as the empire hums with courier horses and accountants, as khans draft edicts and monks debate doctrine, you look up at the night sky above the Mongol plains. Somewhere, Sorghaghtani is sitting by lamplight, listening to reports, sipping broth, adjusting the pieces on a board only she can fully see. She is not queen, she is not general, she is not God, but she is the still center of the spinning wheel, and nothing moves without her touch. You blink against the wind as the world shifts again, this time, not through mourning or maneuvering, but through victory. Mongol sits on the throne. Kublai is governing in China. Hulagu is riding westward into history. And Arik Borka, well, Arik is brooding always a little outside the storm's eye. And through all of this, Sorghaghtani moves quietly in the background, her plan advancing line by line. But now comes the masterstroke elevating Kublai. Of all her sons, he is the most curious, the most outward-looking. He's not just content to rule, he wants to understand. Sorghaghtani always encouraged that inviting Confucian scholars, Buddhist monks, even Taoist mystics to engage with him. While other Mongol nobles sneered at soft Chinese customs, Kublai listened. He didn't just tolerate their worldview, he absorbed it. And when Mongol tasks him with overseeing the northern Chinese territories, Sorghaghtani knows the stakes. This isn't just a governorship, it's a test. The Chinese frontier is wealthy, proud, and restive. It's full of deeply rooted culture and bureaucracy, things that do not bend easily under Mongol boots. But Kublai arrives not with contempt, but with questions. And Sorghaghtani's voice is in his head the whole time. She had always told her sons Don't just conquer the people. Learn their stories. Speak their tongue. Let them see themselves in your rule. So, Kublai surrounds himself with advisors of all kinds. Liu Bingjong, a Confucian scholar and planner. Buddhist monks like Haiyun, Persian administrators with clever tax ideas. He builds schools. He funds grain storage. He adopts elements of Chinese dress and ceremony, not because he forgets who he is, but because he knows how to govern who they are. And yes, some Mongols complain. They see Kublai as going native, as weakening, as forgetting the bow for the brush. But Sorghaghtani defends him not with grand speeches, but by reminding other leaders what matters results, and the results speak for themselves. Kublai restores order to rebellious provinces. He raises revenue without increasing resentment. He integrates the Mongol presence with the Chinese administrative framework so seamlessly that even skeptics have to admit it's working. Historians still debate whether Kublai's later transformation into Emperor of China was inevitable, or whether it was shaped entirely by this period. Either way, the roots go straight back to Sorghaghtani's philosophy. Power is nothing without permanence. Let's linger on one odd little fact. Sorghaghtani was one of the first in her court to implement written record-keeping in multiple languages. She ensured that communications in her estates were documented in both Mongolian script and the local vernacular Uyghur Chinese, even Syriac. She may not have called it transparency, but that's exactly what she was building. A governance system that didn't rely on force, but on trust. And that trust, it spreads. Even as Mongke centralizes control and orders administrative reviews empire-wide, Sorghaghtani remains a steadying voice. She reportedly advised Mongke to be patient with resistant provinces, to avoid rapid religious conversion policies, and to focus on creating reliable systems rather than short-term obedience. These are the lessons of a woman who saw empires rise and fall within her own lifetime. But all of this, the reforms, the education, the diplomacy, had a larger aim. She wanted her sons not just to rule regions, but to rule history. And Kublai is the jewel in that vision. She knows that China isn't just another conquest. It is the conquest. If a Mongol can become emperor of the Middle Kingdom and be accepted, then the Mongol legacy will stretch far beyond raids and rivers of blood. It will become civilization. And so she prepares him not just with books, but with perspective. She teaches him patience. She models restraint. She shows him how to read a room before speaking, how to measure a man by his silences, how to use generosity as a leash. Here's a quieter scene one evening. Not long after Kublai has taken over his governorship, he writes to his mother, seeking advice. The letter survives only in fragments, but one line is telling. How do I lead a people who already think they are kings? And Sorghaghtani's answer, if legend can be trusted, was equally perfect. Make them feel they are still kings. Then show them how you rule among equals. It's not the kind of advice that wins immediate glory. It's the kind that builds dynasties, and build he does. But of course, Sorghaghtani doesn't live forever. Her health begins to decline as the 1250s unfold. She's likely in her 60s, old by steppe standards, and even older by the lifestyle she's endured. The travel, the stress, the endless calculation. But still she works. Even as her joints ache and her vision fades, she continues advising her sons. She listens to court gossip, not with irritation, but with the shrewd interest of someone who knows how fast winds can turn. And most of all, she prepares Kublai for what comes next, because she knows the throne won't stay peaceful forever. Mongol's reforms are not universally loved. The Ugadide and Chagatai lines are simmering. Arik Borka may yet rise in opposition. And when it happens, and it will happen, Kublai will need more than strength. He will need memory, her memory. The lessons, the examples, the quiet logic she modeled for decades. The belief that force opens doors, but only wisdom holds them open. So, as she rests on her final nights wrapped in furs and flickering lamplight, her sons still come to her tent. They kneel, they listen. She speaks softly now, less command, more reflection, but still always the same core message: build something that outlives you, and do it with care. Kublai takes that advice with him, and someday soon it will carry him all the way to the dragon throne. But that, dear traveler, is a tale for later. Tonight you simply watch Sorghaghtani's fire burn low, and you understand she did not live to be emperor. She lived to make emperors. By now the wind across the steppe seems to speak her name, not with fanfare, not with roaring acclaim, just a soft repetition, like the flap of a tense canvas, like a page turning in a distant ledger. Sorghaghtani, Sorghaghtani. Her son, Monka, sits the highest throne in the known world. His decree stretches from the Black Sea to the Korean peninsula. But the texture of his rule, that's hers. In the early years of Monka's reign, the empire faces its most daunting challenge, yet not war, not rebellion, but inertia. It's simply too big, too fast, too brittle. The machine that Genghis built was made to conquer. It wasn't necessarily made to last. But Monka, under Sorghaghtani's tutelage, tries to rewire it. He doesn't want to be remembered as a rider who passed through. He wants to be the Khan who built something that stayed. And here's where you start seeing her fingerprints on the imperial administration in full detail. Census. Yes, a word that probably makes your eyelids droop, but bear with it, because in a world where no one counted the dead, let alone the living, Sorghaghtani had always insisted on knowing what you had before you tried ruling it. So, Monka launches a vast census across the empire. He wants to know how many households, how many fields, how much silk, how many oxen, and more importantly, who's collecting the taxes and who's pocketing them. This wasn't just a bureaucratic nicety. It was revolutionary. One odd little record from Persia describes how Monka's inspectors caught local administrators inflating tax numbers to enrich themselves. Rather than execute them outright, traditional Mongol solution, Monka replaced them with scribes trained under Sorghaghtani's estate model. These scribes used dual ledgers, a cross-auditing system she had pioneered to track livestock across vast herds. Modern accountants eat your hearts out. And the reform didn't stop at counting. Monka standardized weights and measures. He implemented a more uniform legal code. He ordered a review of tax rates across provinces, trying to make sure they reflected productivity rather than favoritism. Historians still argue how effective these reforms really were, whether they reached the distant edges of the empire or stalled in the hands of resistant bureaucrats. But what's undeniable is that the intention was new. It wasn't about wringing the last drop of tribute from terrified peasants. It was about managing an empire, not just raiding one. And where does that intention come from? From a woman who never raised a sword, but knew the cost of wheat. Let's talk about infrastructure. Monka expands the Yam postal system relay stations where messengers can rest, resupply, and swap horses. It's fast, efficient, and it ties the empire together like sinew across bone. Sorghaghtani decades earlier had funded local versions of this system in her own territories. Hers were smaller, yes, but modeled on the same concept. Her messengers knew how to ride through windstorms, how to pass secret messages coded in metaphor, how to bribe gatekeepers with dried apricots and warm wine. Now her son scales it up. And then there's the courts. Under Monka, multiple languages are spoken at court: Persian, Mongolian, Chinese, Turkic dialects, Nestorian Syriac. This isn't a Tower of Babel. It's the echo of a mother who insisted her sons grow up multilingual, literate, and culturally fluid. It's also, frankly, a smart counter to the rising tensions between Mongol elites and local administrators in different regions. If your Khan can understand you, even in your own tongue, you're more likely to trust him. Again, you feel Sorghaghtani's shadow behind every decree. Now here's a fringe curiosity. Monka allegedly consulted physicians from at least 4 different traditions: Chinese herbalists, Muslim anatomists, Indian astrologers, and Nestorian monks skilled in pulse reading. Why? Because his mother taught him that no system has all the answers, that wisdom grows in comparison. She would say, the wind learns nothing from staying in one place. But no rule is without conflict. Even as Monka strengthens the empire's bones, tensions simmer between his brothers. Kublai and Hulagu are effective, but increasingly autonomous. Arik Boka, the wild card, begins to sense that his position is slipping. The center cannot hold forever, not even when it's held by a hand as careful as Sorghaghtani's. Still, while she lives, her influence acts as glue. She continues to counsel moderation. She advises Monka to avoid large-scale religious persecution, even as court hardliners demand that Buddhists or Muslims be brought to heel. She reminds him that temples are easier to tax when they're standing. And, most curiously, she seems to have had a role in cultivating female leadership at lower levels of administration. Some provincial courts begin to see women acting as governors' aides, caravan leaders, even treasury stewards. These may not have been imperial policies, but they reflect a cultural climate that she helped create. One minor account tells of a Nestorian woman in Samarkand overseeing grain distribution during a famine sent by the Khan's court, but rumored to have been a personal recommendation from the mother of the Khans. Whether apocryphal or true, the legend is enough. Her name carries weight far beyond the capital. But the world is changing. The empire is too large, the demands too heavy. Factions begin sharpening their claims. Monka's position remains strong, but only as long as he remains alive. And Sorghaghtani, she's aging now. Her once steady hands tremble slightly as she lifts her writing brush. Her eyes don't see as far, but her mind still calculates farther than most men dare to dream. You picture her on the veranda of her estate, wrapped in layers of fur and silk, sipping broth as her grandchildren play nearby. A court messenger kneels beside her, waiting for her verdict on a provincial complaint. Her son's envoy stands to the side reporting on crop yields in the Yellow River Basin. She listens. She decides. She nods. She still leads, just not from a throne. Because Sorghaghtani never needed one. She understood better than anyone. Real power doesn't shout. It whispers. It moves quietly. And it lasts. By now the empire breathes with rhythms she set in motion. Reforms pulse through provinces. Caravans whisper her legacy over mountain passes. And in China, Kublai, her second son, her gamble takes a long, deliberate step into destiny. It starts modestly enough. Mongke appoints Kublai to govern northern China, giving him command over the most delicate region in the empire, the Song frontier. It's a region thick with culture, wealth, bureaucracy, and resistance. A land where conquest alone means little, and where rule must be performed like theater, delicate, persuasive, and endlessly rehearsed. But Sorghaghtani has prepared him for this role since he was a boy. He doesn't march in shouting Mongol slogans. He rides in wearing Mongol leathers, yes, but he dismounts and listens. He listens to Confucian elders, to Buddhist abbots, to Chinese engineers discussing river dredging. Historians still argue whether this flexibility made him too Sinicized to be a true Mongol, but it's hard to deny the results. Chinese cities open their gates. Officials cooperate. Taxes flow. Back in Karakoram, some mutter. Traditionalists clutch their horses tighter. Arik Burka sharpens his presence among those who still revere the old nomadic ways. But Sorghaghtani's voice still carries weight, even in absentia. Because this is her vision unfolding. Kublai isn't betraying Mongol heritage. He's fulfilling it by conquering not just land, but legitimacy, by showing that a Mongol can rule China not as a foreign tyrant, but as a sovereign. You can almost hear her coaching him from across the steppes. Adapt, don't dissolve. Shape your rule to the vessel that holds it. And shape it he does. Kublai builds an administrative capital in Shangdu. He funds Confucian academies. He reforms tax structures to match agricultural seasons. His court becomes a melting pot of scholars from Tibet, Persia, Central Asia, and Han China. It's not just rule, it's performance. And every gesture, every decree, sealed in 3 languages, every temple spared, every Confucian text cited, is a callback to the education Sorghaghtani gave him. Let's pause for a delicious detail. One court record mentions that Kublai employed a daily ritual of reciting classical Chinese aphorisms before beginning council. This wasn't typical Mongol behavior. It was pageantry. Sorghaghtani would have applauded. She knew the value of ritual. She taught that symbolism wasn't a weakness, it was a currency. And speaking of currency, literally, Kublai begins experimenting with paper money, drawing from Chinese precedent. It's not his invention, but he backs it with Mongol authority, extending its use into newly conquered territories. Another example of blending force with finesse, something she excelled at. Of course, not everyone in his court is thrilled. Some senior Mongol officers grumble that Kublai's court is starting to look like China, that he's giving too much voice to local advisors, too much respect to a conquered people. But Kublai, again echoing Sorghaghtani, doesn't overreact. He doesn't purge. He persuades. He knows that the best way to rule an ancient civilization is to inherit it, not bulldoze it. And still, despite all these signs of rising power, Kublai remains second to Mongke, a loyal governor, a scholar administrator, but never too ambitious, at least not openly. This, too, is Sorghaghtani's teaching. Let power pursue you. Don't chase it until others push it into your hands. But in truth, he is already gathering momentum. And Sorghaghtani, she watches with quiet satisfaction. Imagine her aged now, but sharp as ever, receiving letters in the capital. Couriers dismounting with dispatches stamped in red wax. She unrolls scrolls by candlelight, reading her son's measured reports. Grain yields, temple tax exemptions, silk production forecasts, arrest warrants, phrased with Confucian tact. She smiles, because this isn't just effective governance. This is legacy. There's a fringe tidbit worth sharing. One envoy from the Song dynasty, sent north to negotiate border terms, was reportedly so impressed with Kublai's decorum and administrative literacy that he asked who his primary tutor had been. The answer, my mother. That detail alone, passed from diplomat to chronicler, plants the idea that the mother of these Mongol princes isn't just a footnote. She's a force, and she never once sought a crown. Meanwhile, Mongke continues his central reforms. He launches military campaigns in the south. Hulagu expands into the Islamic world. Arik Burka begins to amass support among more conservative Mongol clans. You can feel the tension rising like dry grass underfoot before a lightning storm. But for now, Sorghaghtani still walks among the living, and while she does, she ensures that no thread is left untied. She reinforces alliances with key steppe families. She ensures that Munka's reforms don't alienate powerful tribal leaders. She prepares Kublai for possible conflict without making him paranoid. She sends gifts to Hulagu's court in the west, reminding him that he too is part of this grand design. One curious account says she even kept detailed charts of interfamily marriages and political debts rolled into scrolls marked with colored ribbons. Her tent wasn't just a residence, it was a war room, and the war she fought was for cohesion, not conquest, and she fought it beautifully. So, as the nights grow longer and the stars settle deeper over the steppes, you see her sitting alone one evening, combing her silver hair with a carved bone comb. Her hands tremble slightly, but her eyes, those eyes, are still clear, still calculating. She knows time is short, but she also knows something else. The work is done. Her son rules China with ink and law. Her eldest reforms an empire with census and discipline. Her youngest watches poised for a final reckoning. And she made it all happen. No battle cry, no statue, just a mother and a plan. By now, Sorghaghtani's name moves through the empire, not as thunder, but as a kind of low hum, felt rather than heard. In Karakoram, officials still refer to her methods when discussing land disputes. In China, Kublai still uses the phrases she once whispered to him while studying scrolls as a boy. Even in distant Baghdad and Samarkand, traders passing through the Mongol checkpoints mutter with reluctant respect about the mother of the empire. And yet, time has its own logic. Sorghaghtani's health is waning. The years have piled atop her shoulders like thick wool cloaks, layer after layer of victories, of griefs, of long-planned moves, now playing out without her needing to push. She no longer walks far. She reads less. But she listens. Always listens. And outside her tent, the world keeps moving. Too fast, perhaps. The reforms she helped Munka craft are pushing against long-established power structures. Some nobles grumble. Some court officials, especially those who profited under Ogedai's more chaotic administration, begin to resist. It's a dangerous moment. The empire is more orderly now, yes, but also less flexible. And when an empire grows rigid, it can crack. Sorghaghtani knows this. She's seen it before. She's studied fallen dynasties. She's read the signs in fading embers, in misplaced scrolls, in whispered betrayals. And she watches Kublai. He is growing more ambitious, not recklessly so. He's her son after all. But ambition is a flame, and flames don't always stay in their lanterns. His court in China becomes grander, his decrees longer, his networks deeper, and somewhere deep in the marrow of the empire, the ground begins to rumble with discontent, not because of Kublai himself, but because everyone can feel the old balance shifting. Back in the heartland, Harik Burka begins to gather strength. He's not a scholar, not a merchant's friend, not a city builder. He's the image of the old Mongol ideal, a rider, a hunter, a man of the open steppe. And to many conservative nobles, especially those who bristle at Kublai's Chinese influences, Harik represents the return to purity. It's not open rebellion, not yet, but Sorghaghtani feels the tension rising like a storm building behind a quiet sky. And so, in her final months, she focuses on memory, not her own, but her son's. She calls for Monka. They speak in private. No scribes, no advisors, just mother and son seated cross-legged as they once were long ago, when he was just a boy learning to tie knots and count herds. She reminds him that the empire is not just a map. It's a promise, one made by Genghis to his people, one made by her to his sons. She tells him to remember the peasants who carry taxes on their backs, the monks who pray for peace even when the armies march, the children born in conquered cities who don't know what came before. They are the empire now, and she urges him gently but firmly not to let a civil war undo what decades of patience built. He listens. You can see it in his face, lined, worried, but attentive. Then she sends for Kublai. Their talk is longer, more complex. She praises him, his reforms, his vision, his restraint. But she warns him too. Do not mistake acceptance for affection, she says. You rule China well because you act like you belong. But you will only keep it if they forget you came from somewhere else. He nods. He wants to speak, maybe to argue, maybe to plead for reassurance. But she silences him with a look. She's said what needs saying. Finally, she calls for Hulagu. His world is far away in the west, his path drenched in dust and ancient stone. But still, she counsels him about justice, about wrath, about the delicate art of leaving cities standing when it benefits the state more than raising them. Terror, she says, opens the door, but only mercy keeps it open. It's the last recorded advice she ever gives, because soon after she dies, no dramatic illness, no assassination, just time folding her back into the earth. She passes quietly in her estate, surrounded by attendants, scholars, grandchildren. No temple bells, no funeral parade, just a stillness so complete it feels cosmic. And when word spreads, it's not just her sons who mourn. In Persia, Hulagu stops mid-campaign and orders days of prayer. In China, Kublai holds a private ceremony and allegedly fasts for a week. In Karakoram, Monke sits alone for hours, refusing food. Even Harik Burka, despite their distant relationship, is said to have whispered to his generals, "She understood the storm better than any of us." And that storm, it's coming. But not yet. For now the empire pauses just for a moment and exhales. Because Sorghaghtani Beki, mother of kings, is gone. But her legacy, it's everywhere. It's in the tax codes, in the temple restorations, in the diplomacy with Europe, in the quiet literacy of an empire that once only galloped and burned. She didn't write laws. She wrote minds. And that's why, even now, you can feel her, if you listen closely, still moving behind the fabric of the Mongol world. A whisper, a rhythm, a queen with no crown, and yet the mother of empires. The world doesn't stand still after she's gone. It never does not, in empires carved by hooves and hardened by winter winds. But without Sorghaghtani's quiet balancing hand, you start to hear the creaks in the scaffolding. The empire she helped shape begins to stretch itself in all directions. Mongol still rules from the center, pushing reforms like gears through rust. Kublai continues his experiment in governing China like a native. Hulagu's western campaign rumbles ever further into Persian lands, brushing against the Islamic world with the full weight of Mongol steel. And Arik Boka, out on the steppes, watches, waits, and wonders if perhaps the old ways weren't better. But let's turn your ear to something less obvious, something more unexpected. You've heard of Marco Polo, of course, the Venetian merchant who traveled east and later spun tales of glittering palaces, silk roads, and Mongol Khans who ruled like gods. His writings would shape Western imagination for centuries. But here's the twist most people forget. The world Marco Polo walked into, the world he found so mesmerizing, was one Sorghaghtani had already shaped. He doesn't meet her, of course. She's long gone by the time he arrives. But her fingerprints are all over the place. The bridges Kublai built Sorghaghtani funded the engineers. The bureaucratic policies Marco admired, they're Mongol's laws, drawn from her governance playbook. Even the religious tolerance Polo found so astonishing, how Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others were allowed to coexist, is a direct continuation of her philosophy. Historians still argue whether Marco Polo exaggerated his tales. Maybe he did. But even if he only caught the echo of truth, it was an echo Sorghaghtani had launched years earlier. Let's zoom in on one detail. Polo mentions the use of paper money across vast distances with stamped seals and trusted officials overseeing its flow. He treats it like sorcery. And, yes, it was extraordinary. But to someone like Sorghaghtani, it would have made perfect sense. She understood trade. She understood how to build systems people would trust even if they didn't know who was behind them. And there's another thread, less documented, more whispered. In the Nestorian communities scattered along the Silk Road, tales lingered of a woman who had once ruled without ruling. They spoke of her with reverence, as someone who had not only protected their churches and schools, but had elevated Nestorian clerics to positions of influence. Some even began to call her our Queen of the East, a title never formally given but deeply felt. You might think that's myth-making, but is it? Every empire needs its icons. And in a world ruled by men, where conquest is often remembered in blood, Sorghaghtani's story offers a different kind of legend. Not a woman of war, a woman of framework. And that legacy spreads further still. In Baghdad, Hulagu eventually leads a campaign that topples the Abbasid Caliphate, a brutal, world-altering moment. But after the fires die down, he builds observatories. He funds translations of ancient Greek texts. His court becomes a haven for astronomers and poets. That paradox, the scholar-warrior who raises and then rebuilds. That's Sorghaghtani too. She raised her sons to know that fear conquers, but ideas endure. Even in China, Kublai's reign becomes more than just administrative reform. He commissions history projects. He funds the preservation of Chinese classics. He opens the door for Tibetan Buddhism to flourish. It's as if he understood, perhaps even instinctively, that empire wasn't about how much you took, but how much you could hold without breaking it. And once again you find her lessons at the root. Now here's a quirky little aside. In the city of Hangzhou, decades after Kublai had fully established the Yuan dynasty, one local historian wrote in his private journal that the Mongol court rules like a father, but whispers like a mother. He likely meant it metaphorically. But imagine if he'd known. Imagine if he'd realized that the whisper had a name, Sorghaghtani. Even centuries later, certain administrative patterns introduced under her sons would remain embedded in Chinese bureaucracy. Not perfectly, not entirely, but enough to show that her approach, quiet, thoughtful, measured, had outlived her. And isn't that the final measure of power? To write systems so sturdy they stand even after your bones have turned to dust. Of course, no legacy is without tension. Arik Boka's growing discontent is no longer a footnote. He's gathering forces, claiming the right to rule as the true Mongol heir, not as a bureaucrat, not as an emperor cloaked in silk, but as a Khan of the old kind. His message is clear. The steppe doesn't need scribes. It needs writers, and the civil war that follows the Tolui civil war would shake the empire Sorghaghtani spent her life threading together. But that's coming. For now, in this moment, between rumble and rupture, the empire still moves to her cadence. Policies hold, trade routes hum, religions coexist, and the sons she raised, at least for now, rule as she taught them. So tonight, as you lie back beneath the sweep of stars once brushed by her gaze, remember this. You've heard of Genghis Khan, you've heard of Kublai, but history only tells half the tale. Because without Sorghaghtani Beki, there is no Mongol Empire as you know it. There are only ashes. The sky hangs heavy over the steppes, now not with rain, but with the weight of decisions. For all the empire's breadth, It narrows in this moment to a single point of tension. Who rules next? Mongke, Sorghaghtani's eldest and most even-handed son, is still in power. His reforms are working slowly, not without friction, but they're working. Grain flows more predictably, taxes are clearer, the yam system hums. Provinces mostly cooperate, and yet beneath that surface calm, the old fault lines grind against each other. Because empires this big, they don't hold themselves together. And Mongke, for all his discipline, cannot ignore what's brewing between his younger brothers. Kublai is governing China with increasing independence. His court is full of Chinese scholars. His rituals, Confucian, inspired his clothing, slowly shifting from leather to silk. Mongol traditionalists are alarmed, and the whispers grow louder. Has Kublai forgotten his saddle? Meanwhile, Arik Boke gathers his own camp in Karakoram. He represents the purity of the steppes, the untouched, untamed legacy of Genghis himself. He's popular among the old guard, the warrior elites, the horse lords who sneer at Chinese etiquette and palace protocol. And though no swords have been drawn yet, everyone knows it's coming. And in this tightening spiral you begin to feel her absence. Sorghaghtani is gone, and with her goes the subtle steadying thread that once kept these sons from unraveling. She would have known how to slow this down, how to speak softly to Arik, to remind Kublai that silk and scrolls won't shield him from a brother's spear. But she's no longer there to whisper, and the empire she helped hold together, it's bracing for a test. Still, her influence lingers, like scent on old fabric, like the impression left in a well-worn saddle. Mongke does his best to contain the rift. He summons both brothers to court, urges cooperation, insists on unity. He reminds them that the empire is not theirs. It belongs to the legacy of their grandfather, that they are not rivals, but guardians. But Sorghaghtani would have known better, because her brilliance wasn't just in education or diplomacy. It was in knowing people. And she would have seen what Mongke perhaps can't yet accept, that these brothers are no longer children bound by maternal command. They are rulers now, independent, proud, and watched by thousands. Their moves ripple through provinces and armies like stones dropped in water. Here's a peculiar detail. Mongke reportedly ordered a new census in China during this period, hoping that better data would calm the storm. But Sorghaghtani would have told him, this isn't about data, it's about dignity. Meanwhile, Kublai continues to govern with quiet confidence. He builds new roads, introduces agricultural reforms, encourages scholars to debate in his court, Confucians, Buddhists, Muslims. It's a kaleidoscope of ideas, and it works mostly. But he's growing stronger, too strong for Arik's comfort. And Arik, he sharpens his message. He doesn't just say, Kublai is becoming too Chinese. He says, Kublai is betraying Mongol identity. The narrative takes root quickly. among horsemen and herders, among veterans of past campaigns. We don't need Confucian scrolls, they say. We need strength, simplicity, the step. It's the beginning of ideological division. One brother represents integration, tolerance, systemization. The other, tradition, mobility, raw power. And, again, though no one says it, they're reenacting a drama. Sorghaghtani once wrote quietly in the background. She taught Kublai to listen to bend. She taught Arik to lead, to guard the ancestral flame. And now those two ideas are on a collision course. But before that clash ignites history, throws another twist. Monka dies. The circumstances are unclear. Illness during campaign, maybe dysentery, maybe something worse. Historians still argue. Some blame poor medical care. Some wonder about divine punishment. Some even suggest foul play, though there's no proof. All that matters is this: the emperor is dead. And the empire, it splits. Not geographically, not yet, but politically. Because now there is no mother, no Monka, only brothers and ambition. The Kurultai, the great council, must choose a new great Khan. And here comes the break. Sorghaghtani spent her life preventing. Kublai, from China, holds his own Kurultai, surrounded by Chinese officials, Central Asian allies, his own networks of power. They declare him Great Khan. But at the same time, in Karakoram, Arik Borka does the same. Two brothers, two thrones, one empire, split. This is the beginning of the Tolui Civil War. It will rage for years. Armies will march. Alliances will fracture. Cities will burn. And the once seamless threads of the Mongol world will fray. And yet, if you lean in, you can still hear Sorghaghtani, not scolding, not pleading, just reminding. You rule not because of your birth. You rule because others believe in the world you build. Arik builds the past. Kublai builds the future. And somewhere between them, her legacy is caught, torn, tested, and if the empire survives, proven. The storm breaks. For years, Sorghaghtani had kept the winds at bay, redirected, softened, absorbed into diplomatic silences and quiet reforms. But now, without her presence or Monka's central authority, the storm tears across the empire like a steppe fire chasing dry grass. This is no border skirmish, no polite disagreement at a council fire. This is war, brother against brother. Arik Boke, the guardian of tradition, declares himself the rightful great Khan from Karakoram, backed by steppe elites, traditionalists, and powerful factions who feel alienated by the increasingly cosmopolitan rule of Kublai. And Kublai, from his court in China, he returns the declaration in kind. His army swells with support from Chinese administrators, Mongol nobles stationed in the east, and subject peoples who see in him not just a ruler, but a system. And so begins the Tolui Civil War, the very thing Sorghaghtani worked her whole life to prevent. Historians still debate whether this conflict was inevitable, whether the brothers were always destined to clash, or if Mongol's death simply rushed the confrontation. But one thing is certain: with Sorghaghtani gone, no one remains who can cool both sides. Her methods, her voice, her patience, her moral compass are gone. Now it's horses, now it's arrows, now it's personal. But here's what makes this war so strange. Both brothers still claim to uphold Genghis Khan's legacy. They just interpret it differently. Arik Boke believes in preservation, the open steppe, the traditions of council-based rule, the central tent as the empire's heart. His warriors scorn bureaucracy and silk robes. They live for mobility, for the wind, for the memory of when Mongols feared nothing. Kublai believes in evolution, in cities as engines, in systems as armor, in adopting what works, even if it comes from conquered peoples. He wears Mongol boots, but reads Chinese texts. His war isn't just for a title, it's for a model of empire. And the empire, it groans. Factions fracture. Alliances shift weekly. Provinces once governed peacefully now send their grain taxes with a side of mercenaries. One curious footnote records show that even Nestorian Christian communities, once unified under Sorghaghtani's protection, now split loyalties between the brothers, some siding with Arik for tradition, others with Kublai for security. Her legacy, like her empire, is being pulled apart. Still, Sorghaghtani's lessons linger in Kublai's war strategy. He doesn't just campaign with arrows, he campaigns with ideas. When he takes cities loyal to Arik, he doesn't burn them. He pardons officials, reinstates tax systems, offers stability. And his letters sent ahead by couriers quote Confucian values promising peace under his banner. Meanwhile, Arik fights like a lion. His armies are more mobile, his tactics more traditional. He wins early battles through speed and raw force. But logistics, always Sorghaghtani's specialty, begin to haunt him. Kublai controls the fertile plains of northern China. He has roads, grain, gold, and bureaucrats. Arik controls warriors and memory. And memory is harder to eat. By 1264, the tide turns. Arik's forces begin to falter, starved out, maneuvered, politically isolated. More nobles defect to Kublai. Even some of Arik's former allies begin sending messengers to the east, offering quiet allegiance in exchange for forgiveness. Arik Boke, stubborn until the end, finally surrenders, and Kublai. He does not execute his brother. He imprisons him, but treats him well. A decision that echoes her. Sorghaghtani had always taught victory is not dominance, it's what happens after. You can imagine her whispering through time. A ruler's greatness is tested in mercy, not just in conquest. But don't mistake this mercy for weakness. Kublai consolidates power quickly. He rewards loyalty, reorganizes governance, and formally declares himself Great Khan of the Mongol Empire, but also, notably, Emperor of China. This dual identity is no accident. It's a culmination of her. Kublai moves the capital to Dadu, present-day Beijing. He wears Chinese robes at ceremony and Mongol leather on campaign. He hosts Confucian debates and funds Tibetan monasteries. He maintains Mongol military structure while expanding civil bureaucracy. He isn't choosing sides. He's becoming both. And in doing so, he stabilizes the East, turning what was once a military occupation into a dynasty, the Yuan dynasty. Sorghaghtani never lived to see this crown placed. But this was the vision she whispered into him at night when he was a boy tracing maps in the dirt. Not just conquest, continuity. The war left scars. The empire will never be as united as it was in her lifetime, but it endures. And through it all, her quiet signature remains etched across every policy, every court ceremony, every bridge Kublai funds, and every temple he leaves standing. Even in death, Sorghaghtani remains present not in portraits, but in protocol, not in gold, but in governance. So tonight, as you sit beneath the shadow of Mongol banners snapping in the wind, you remember empires rise in battle, but they survive by design. And no one designed with more care, more subtlety, more generational intent than the mother of kings. Years pass, and while history rushes forward, emperors rise and fall, maps shift like sand, Sorghaghtani's presence lingers in the quiet spaces between grand events, not in fanfare, but in function. By now, Kublai Khan has solidified his rule over China. The Yuan dynasty is no longer just a Mongol occupation, it's a government. It has departments, tax systems, ceremonial calendars, flood control plans, and its strength lies not in endless conquest, but in the surprisingly tedious beauty of organization. Exactly as Sorghaghtani would have wanted. And what's remarkable is how much of her DNA still runs through the system, quiet, invisible yet unmistakable to those who know where to look. The empire she envisioned didn't just stretch across territories. It stretched across disciplines, across languages, across people. Take, for instance, the curious fact that under Kublai, the imperial court used 4 official languages: Mongolian, Chinese, Persian, and Tibetan, not just for translation, but for communication policy and cultural negotiation. It wasn't an accident. Sorghaghtani had always insisted that understanding was more powerful than subjugation, that if you could speak to a people, you were halfway to ruling them already. Or consider Kublai's Bureau of Islamic Astronomy. Yes, that was a real thing. staffed by Muslim scholars from Persia, funded by the Yuan court, to refine calendars, navigation, and timekeeping. That idea, pure Sorghaghtani. She'd always embraced science. She knew that empire wasn't just ruled by armies, it was ruled by accuracy, and temples Sorghaghtani had protected them of all faiths for practical as well as philosophical reasons. Now Kublai does the same, funding Buddhist monasteries, Confucian academies, even preserving Nestorian churches, a pluralism not born of softness, but of strategy. Historians still argue whether Kublai was genuinely tolerant or just politically clever. But anyone who studied under Sorghaghtani would know it was always both. You don't need to love every belief. You just need to understand what it gives the people who hold it. Now let's turn to administration. Kublai continues to refine land tax policies, working from the census structure Monka initiated, which of course Sorghaghtani had modeled decades earlier on her own estates. She had known her shepherds by name, her merchants by rote, her scribes by penmanship. That attention to detail to people becomes the cornerstone of Mongol governance under the Yuan. And, beyond systems, her influence persists in Kublai's demeanor. He is, by Mongol standards, unusually formal, unusually reflective. He doesn't shout orders from horseback. He convenes councils, invites dissenting voices, deliberates. And while some might call that softness, it's what allows him to hold what others only took. One quirky court account tells of a Chinese official who, after years of resisting Mongol rule, finally agreed to serve under Kublai. When asked why, he said, "This one listens like a man raised by still water." That image, that stillness, that's Sorghaghtani. But even as her son's dynasty flourishes, the world around it begins to stretch thin. Out west, the Ilkhanate founded by Hulagu rattles with succession disputes. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia grows increasingly autonomous. The Golden Horde in Russia splits culturally from the Eastern courts. The great Mongol experiment, that vast continent-spanning unity, is beginning to splinter. And yet, it doesn't collapse. Why? Because her sons didn't just rule territories. They built templates, systems that could survive their deaths. In Persia, Hulagu's descendants continue building infrastructure libraries, astronomical observatories, echoes of her values. In China, Kublai's dynasty survives, beyond him shaky at times, yes, but grounded in bureaucratic muscle that came from her design. And even among the Mongols who rebel against the center, there's a grudging respect for the way the Tolui line held power, not with sheer brutality, but with persistence, education, and infrastructure. Sorghaghtani had taught that strength is not dominance, it's durability, and that's what endures. Now let's zoom in one last time on a moment, quiet, unspectacular, but telling. A court scribe organizing archives in Kublai's new capital finds an old scroll, its worn edges crumbling. It bears her name. It's a ledger, simple, factual, a record of livestock tax allotments, grain yields from decades past. He reads it. It's not poetry. It's not history. But in its precision, in its care, he sees the foundation of everything around him. And maybe, just maybe, he whispers her name. Because in a world that often remembers destruction more vividly than design, Sorghaghtani's greatness lives not in what was broken, but in what was built and never lost. You might think empires fade in fire or fracture like glass, but sometimes they fade in whispers, soft policy shifts, forgotten birthdays, the slow erosion of memory. And in the twilight of the Mongol age, Sorghaghtani's legacy begins to move from living influence to ancestral myth. Kublai rules on now, fully enthroned as emperor of the Yuan dynasty. His robes are silk, his court is vast. His attention is split between military campaigns and logistics reports written on mulberry paper. He is every inch the kind of ruler Sorghaghtani trained him to be, focused, deliberate, and adaptive. But things are shifting. The Yuan court is growing increasingly Chinese. The Mongol identity that once rooted Kublai in the windswept plains is thinning in the incense-soaked halls of the Forbidden City. Mongol generals begin to lose patience with civil administrators. Regional nobles bristle at Han court etiquette. Distant khanates look toward Karakoram, or increasingly away from it, for direction. And all the while, the whisper of her lessons grows fainter. Not because they failed, but because they worked too well. You see, Sorghaghtani had raised sons to be more than conquerors. She raised them to be systems. And systems, once set in motion, become their own gravity, pulling new leaders, new ideas, and new loyalties into their orbit. That's what makes her legacy so slippery. It isn't loud. It doesn't wear medals. It seeps into structures, into how things are done, until no one remembers who first asked the question, what if we ruled differently? Take Kublai's law codes, for instance. They blend Mongol military discipline with Chinese administrative norms. They offer protections for multiple religions. They establish punishment for corrupt tax collectors, but also stipends for widows. They are essentially a bureaucratic tapestry. And at the center of that loom, her, even Arik Broca, long defeated, long dead, leaves a strange echo. His rebellion, while unsuccessful, forces Kublai to clarify the empire's shape, not just a patchwork of Mongol tribes, but a unified, adaptive state. In this, too, Sorghaghtani's legacy is paradoxically affirmed through the very conflict she sought to avoid. Let's turn briefly to education. Under Kublai, schools are built not just for military training, but for civil service. Examinations are restructured. Local histories are collected. Libraries are expanded. One delightful fringe note, there's a story of a Nestorian monk named Isa, assigned as a tutor to the children of Mongol officials in the Yuan court. When asked what teaching method he used, he reportedly answered, "The same one the Khan's mother used, observation, repetition, respect. Even centuries later, her style remains shorthand for excellence. And what about the Silk Road still humming? In fact, it thrives under Kublai. Caravan routes are protected, relay stations maintained, international merchants, Armenians, Persians, Italians report back to Europe that the Mongol East is not a barbarian's land, but a systematized network of trade, taxation, and law. You get the sense that Sorghaghtani would have loved watching the flowcharts. But there's a sadness here too, because while the systems grow stronger, her story starts to fade. In the official UN histories, her name is present but peripheral. She is described with honorifics: wise, virtuous, generous, but not examined, not explored. No pages dedicated to her strategies, her reforms, her maneuvering. It's the old problem. Empire remembers the thrones, not the scaffolding. And she was scaffolding. Essential, invisible, but not forgotten. Not entirely. Here's a quiet testament, a surviving Nestorian manuscript from the 14th century includes a prayer for the matron of the steppes who taught rulers to listen. It doesn't name her, but there's no question who it means. In remote parts of Central Asia, stories linger of a woman who once ruled with parchment, not sword. Some say she could read 5 languages. Some say she predicted eclipses. Some say she never spoke above a whisper, and yet commanded the respect of all Khans. It's mythology, yes, but it's truth, too. Because in the end, Sorghaghtani Beki becomes something more than a historical figure. She becomes a pattern. She becomes the memory behind good governance, the mother, echo, behind mercy, the shadow behind the hand that steadies the empire, not just in her time, but in every time that followed. So tonight, as the stars wheel quietly over the ruins of 1,000 old palaces, and the wind picks up faint voices across the plains, remember, not all rulers wear crowns. Some simply shape the heads that do. You'd think by now the world would have moved on. The empire she helped shape stretches far behind you, a trail of battles and reforms, of sons and dynasties. But, oddly, Sorghaghtani's influence doesn't just fade, it evolves. Long after her death, her name surfaces in strange places. In Persian chronicles, where scholars puzzle over how a Christian woman could command such deference in a court of shamanistic horse lords. In Chinese records, where she's listed not among warriors or consorts, but quietly categorized as a key figure in early UN administrative philosophy. Even in Russian steppe folklore, she's whispered about as the woman who gave birth to thunder. She didn't write poetry. She didn't lead armies. She simply outlasted everyone by embedding herself not in legend but in structure, and structure endures. Take, for instance, the Ilkhanate in Persia. Founded by her son Hulagu, it bears all the fingerprints of Sorghaghtani's hand. Despite his infamous sack of Baghdad, Hulagu becomes a surprisingly engaged ruler. He funds hospitals, He supports scientists. He consults with astrologers and physicians, not to divine omens, but to plan calendars, military campaigns, and irrigation schedules. One Persian vizier writing decades after her death notes, "The sons of Tolui governed not as conquerors, but as keepers. They opened their ears before their mouths." Where do you think they learned that even in the far west, where the Golden Horde grows increasingly autonomous and Islamic, there's subtle deference to the system she built? Trade routes established under her sons are still honored. Taxation patterns echo Munka's census model. Couriers still quote policies first developed in her household. And in the Yuan court, Kublai continues to rule long and hard. He grows heavier with age, slower, more entangled in the rituals of empire. But the foundation Sorghaghtani laid remains. Her style conservative in speech, aggressive in planning, translates well into imperial bureaucracy. You see it in the appointment of regional governors with mixed ethnic backgrounds, in the emphasis on local officials learning multiple languages, in the open-door policies of courts that host Confucians in the morning, Buddhists at noon, and Nestorians before dinner. One fringe anecdote worth savoring: a Venetian merchant in Kublai's court, possibly not Marco Polo, but one of his contemporaries, writes home astonished at how women in Mongol lands can own land, run businesses, and even give orders in court. He chalks it up to Mongol wildness, but we know better. Sorghaghtani didn't push against her culture. She worked within it, wielding its rules like tools, like paintbrushes. She never had to shout about equality. She just did the job better than most men. And in doing so, she normalized competence. The women who came after her, they had space to lead because she carved it open. Still, by the early 14th century, cracks begin to show. The empire starts splitting permanently. The Khanates no longer pretend to follow a single great Khan. Kublai's successors struggle to hold China together. Rebellions bubble up. Economies falter. Factions multiply. But through the chaos, echoes remain: the administrative reforms, the diplomatic outreach, the education of future rulers. They're not gone, they're simply taken for granted. That might be the most Sorghaghtani thing of all, because her greatness was never in how brightly she shone. It was in how long her light lasted, even after the flame itself went out. Let's zoom into a quiet scene. A scribe in Yuan, China, late in the 14th century, is compiling a new handbook on provincial governance. He finds old records, yellowed and worn with notes in 3 scripts: Mongolian, Persian, and Chinese. The orders are brief, practical, no flourish. Just clear rules for grain collection, caravan taxation, and flood management. In the margin, someone has written, "From the house of Tolui's woman." No name, just a direction. But that's all it takes. She's still there, in the paperwork, in the margins, in the air. It's strange to think of someone so powerful being so hard to spot. But that was her superpower, wasn't it? She didn't need a statue. She didn't need a crown. She didn't even need to be seen. She just needed to be understood. And now, as the empire drifts into history books and legend, the shape of her work remains like a tent frame, standing long after the fabric has rotted. So tonight, as the winds whip through what was once Karakoram, and the moonlight touches the ridges of old battlefields and council grounds, you pause, you listen, and in the silence you hear it. Not the echo of war drums, not the clatter of hooves, but the quiet, steady breath of a woman planning 50 years ahead. Time stretches out now, like the steppe itself, vast quiet and tinged with the memory of motion. Empires rise, as they always do, and fall, as they always will. But in the rippling aftermath, certain figures remain not as ghosts, but as frameworks. Sorghaghtani Beki is one of them. By the early 1300s, Kublai is gone. His successors, less charismatic, less skilled, inherit not just an empire, but expectations. Systems she helped build are still functioning, but creaking now, under the weight of war, rebellion, and indifference. The Yuan court becomes more Chinese in style, more insular in perspective, and more entangled in ceremony than action. And yet, the bones of her governance remain intact. Like an old tent structure holding firm under a sagging canopy, Sorghaghtani's reforms still shape how officials draft tax decrees, how governors interface with minority communities, and how courts record decisions in 3, sometimes 4 languages. There's something oddly comforting in that. The idea that while leaders falter and maps bleed administrative logic endures. Let's look west again. In Persia, the Ilkhanate fragments after Hulagu's death, religious tensions increase. Court factions grow more aggressive. But historians note how long the state survives on the scaffolding Sorghaghtani instilled in Hulagu. Mixed governance, religious tolerance, at least for a time, and bureaucratic pragmatism over zealotry. And even after the Ilkhanate collapses, the concept of a cosmopolitan court, one that listens across faiths and tribes, persists in later Persian empires. Sorghaghtani's influence isn't always named, but it's there, like an old signature beneath new paint. In Central Asia, as the Chagatai Khanate drifts into its own cultural identity, Sorghaghtani's impact is more subtle. Women in elite Mongol circles continue to hold land, administer troops, and influence succession. Not always power ebbs, but often enough that scribes still note their presence as customary. And in China, centuries later, when Ming officials sift through Yuan records to compile histories of the fallen dynasty, they find traces of her. Instructions penned in careful script, orders approved by Monka but drafted in her model, policies that prioritized data, not declarations. One Ming official clearly baffled writes, In these archives, one sees governance rooted in restraint, not weakness, but quiet organization. He doesn't know her name, but he's describing her perfectly. It's one of the ironies of legacy. The louder you shout, the faster you're forgotten. But Sorghaghtani, she whispered, and she is still everywhere. Here is a detail often overlooked when the Mongol postal system, the yam, finally collapses. It's not due to neglect or inefficiency. It collapses because the idea of transcontinental cooperation begins to die. The empire splits, not from poor governance, but from shattered vision. Sorghaghtani had offered a vision where the steppe and the city were not enemies, where tradition didn't have to mean stagnation, where a Mongol prince could rule a Buddhist province using Persian engineers and Chinese tax records, and no one blinked. That vision was her greatest act of architecture. Not roads, not palaces, but possibility. And so, centuries later, when historians trace the threads of Eurasian development, when they talk about how silk moved from Xi'an to Venice, or how Arabic numerals spread across Asia, or how paper money became a norm, they inevitably brush against her legacy, even if they don't say her name, even if they don't realize. Let's return once more to her sons. Mongke, who turned war into order. Kublai, who turned conquest into civilization. Hulagu, who burned and then built. Arik Boka, who resisted but still obeyed the rhythm she had taught them all. Each of them carried her mark in different ways. And after their deaths, after the banners fell and the thrones were overturned, it was her way of thinking that lasted longest. You might call it maternal strategy, or steppe diplomacy, or simply wisdom. And now, as night deepens across the plains, as the stars peer down on ruins and rebuilt cities alike, you sit in the quiet and realize something else. Sorghaghtani never needed history to remember her name. She built a world that remembered her thinking. She raised sons who ruled continents. She changed diplomacy by normalizing empathy. She won wars without armies. She ruled empires without thrones. And she taught the greatest lesson of all. True power doesn't command. It endures. The wind on the steppe carries fewer names now. Once it murmured Genghis, Tolui, Mongke, Kublai, Hulagu, and woven among them, if you listened carefully, Sorghaghtani. But time, as it always does, moves on. The empire splinters, the khanates harden into borders, the Yuan falls, the Ilkhanate dissolves, the Silk Road fades beneath shifting dunes and shifting powers, and still some part of her remains, not in gold, not in granite, but in habits, in how rulers weigh patience against pride, in how bureaucrats count grain, not just glory, in how leaders speak before they strike. Her name, once whispered in awe among courtiers and clerics, is now more legend than lineage. Even scholars struggle to find full records of her. A paragraph here, a reverent mention there. But those fragments tell a story not of spectacle, but of substance. It's in the letters of her sons, the policies they enacted, the reforms they sustained long after the battles were over. It's in the strange longevity of her method. Because while empires fall with clamor, governance often survives with a whisper. And she, quiet, calculated, unshakable, was that whisper. Let's imagine for a moment her final day. No palace, no crowd, just the hush of felt walls, the rustle of parchment, the crackle of fire. Outside, the wind brushes past her yurt unknowing. Inside, she breathes slowly. The sons she raised now carry her decisions like heirlooms, embedded, invisible, and unshakable. Perhaps she smiles once quietly as she hears a messenger arrive, a letter from Kublai, or a report from Mongol's council, not for praise, but to inform, because that was her measure of power, to be trusted with truth. And then, with no fanfare, she's gone. But her ripple never stops. Because legacy isn't what people say about you. It's what they do when you're no longer there to remind them. And Sorghaghtani taught rulers to rule with foresight. She taught empires to breathe. So tonight, as you drift off into sleep, safe beneath your own kind of tent brick, or beam, or cotton, you're resting in a world shaped in part by her hand. You've walked through her life now, step by careful step, from the chilly yurt of her birth to the courts of emperors. You've seen her guide armies. She never rode with designed thrones she never sat on, and raised sons who changed the map forever. And now, in the hush between sleep and waking, her story settles around you like a blanket, not loud, not bright, but enduring, just like she was. The wind across the steppe quiets now, the stars above blinking a little softer. You've walked a long road tonight across mountains and deserts, through smoky yurts and golden courts. You've listened to council whispers and watched suns rise beneath a mother's steady hand. Let it all slow now. Let the names fade into gentle murmurs. Let the scrolls roll themselves back up. There's no more planning to do, no more maps to redraw, no more suns to guide. Sorghaghtani's work is done, and so is yours for tonight. Your shoulders sink a little deeper into rest, your breath matching the soft rhythm of hoofbeats far, far away. No need to chase them. You've seen where they go. You've witnessed the quiet grace of legacy, the kind that doesn't demand attention, only continuity. Outside, the night air cools. The lamps are out. The fire is coals. And everything is ready for sleep. So exhale. Let your thoughts settle like parchment on a desk. And know that even in your stillness, you're part of that great ripple. One choice leading to another. One calm voice shaping those who come next. Just as she did. Good night, traveler. Sleep deep. And dream of quiet queens,